Thank you. Growing up in the 70s felt like an adventure. It was a very different time to today. There was a sense of openness, somehow a feeling of possibilities. I think many things had changed in the decade before, and you could still feel that that world was somehow ready to go somewhere. Even as a very young kid, for me, this was a notion that I felt very strongly. But life was also very simple. We didn't go to restaurants. We went to have a picnic outside. It was simple in many ways, but it was also intense, and it had a very strong sense of reality. People were talking. It was political times. People were speculating about the future. People had ideas. And somehow my parents, when I was very young, they took me everywhere. They took me to hanging out with their friends. They took me to museums. They took me to concerts. They took me to parties. I remember even in the university, there were many parties, and I was that small, but somehow with it. And the sense of the strength of human connections and everything that happened prevails for me today as a notion of the things that maybe we could long for or we could aim for. When I was born, both my parents were students. They had no money, they had no maid. So my father had to take me to university every day, and he was studying architecture. So I grew up in architecture school. And I spent the first years of my life dismantling models of poor students that I found somewhere because they were my toys. And it was an interesting way to become familiar with a matter that in the end, of course, stayed with me for my entire life. But my father introduced me to a lot of things. I think today he taught me how to think. This was maybe the most important thing. He taught me how to think, he taught me how to focus, but he in a way taught me how to, what the issue of practice in architecture would be, but also what the thinking was, what the theory was, what maybe the philosophy was. I started to work already when I was 14 in his office. First designs during the day. I went to school in the afternoon, and in the evenings I worked in the office. When I was 16, my father came to me and said, like, your mom and I, we're going to go on vacation. There are 2 construction sites. I will take you there tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, we're leaving. I show you what's going on, and then you go to the site every day and you make sure things keep going. We went the first day. They left the next day. On the third day, I went to site number 1. The workers had just taken out, it was a conversion of an old historic building, and the workers had taken out a wall on the ground floor. And the middle of the house had just come down by 20 centimeters. No door was moving in the entire building. I came to the site and the worker said, like, look what happened. You're the architect, you have to tell us what to do. I was 16. Then I sat down with them and I said, like, so what can we do? And we discussed for a few hours and jointly decided on a strategy for how to jack up the building, create a new beam and so on, and how to solve the problem. The second site I came to, some worker had made a hole in the wall that was actually not the wall of the building, but to the neighbor. And there was a lawyer with a dictation machine saying, like, so we're here to record what happened, and, like, can you tell us what happened? So this was a kind of brutal, fast-track introduction to the reality of architecture. I later on went on to build 2 houses, or renovate one and almost build another together with him, with our own hands. There was an old house in Italy that was completely falling apart, and a little house we would live in Germany that we completely built ourselves. We couldn't bring contractors in, we did everything. We did the tiling, we did the plasterboard ceilings, we did walls, we did windows, everything. So there was a very practical introduction also into the life of an architect. I then was sent to work on a real construction site. First day, 8 hours, sledgehammer. I came back in bed, was shaking the whole night and thought like, this is a crazy tough job. But it was, of course, it was about understanding what we as architects actually do out there when we give our nice drawings and our nice plans, and what would the reality be like when these things actually get built. Another very important part of my childhood was that once I had reached the age of kindergarten, my parents thought it was very important to be in a bigger context. They founded the first international kindergarten in my hometown, and I actually grew up with people in Germany, and nobody was German. I actually had no German friends. I had friends from Vietnam, I had friends from Czechoslovakia, I had friends from South America. So for me, it was completely normal. My entire childhood was actually a mix of cultures and a being together. And maybe in many ways, I realized later it could explain the ease with which, in the later part of my life, without having any plan for it, I lived in 10 different countries in my life. I traveled to so many, I work in so many, but I literally lived in all these different countries. And for me, it was always one of the most important and interesting things of my life, but also my work, to find that exchange with other cultures. When I was 10 years old, something crazy happened. My grandparents gifted me a ticket. Actually, me and my best friend, who was also 10 years old, and his sister, who was 9 years old, the three of us were flying alone to New York. I mean, there was somebody there that we would ultimately, his grandparents were living there, but we made this trip, this journey, 10 years old, alone. We had to change over plane in Copenhagen, and we traveled to New York. And this was sort of my first encounter with a city. And I was deeply impressed by this derelict monstrosity that this city had. And at the same time, I realized that a city also really had adventure. It was full of unexpected things. And this sense of adventure was something, again, that kept being strong, and that told me that maybe in the things and with the things that we do, we have to seek some kind of adventure. I also wanted to go to these two towers that were standing downtown, the Twin Towers, World Trade Center, at the time the tallest buildings in the world. And I remember lying down on one of these benches in the public space and looking up and thinking, why are they not taller? It looked like, but then I realized you couldn't tell actually how tall they are because they were completely scaleless. And I felt it was strange that architecture could have absolutely no scale. Back home. My hometown, Karlsruhe, in Germany, it's not really famous at all, but if it could be famous for something, then maybe for its incredibly strong Baroque city plan, a castle in the middle and the rays of the sun going out as the streets. I never thought that was particularly interesting. I thought what was really interesting about the city, that it was actually half city, half forest. There's actually one line. In the south is the city, and in the north is nature. And I thought this relationship between the built environment and the natural environment was something quite explicit, and it had one incredible advantage. When you were sick and tired of school, you wanted to skip classes, you just had to cross the line. Once you were in the forest, nobody could find you. It was a perfect plan for escape. But it was an interesting relationship of urbanism, architecture, and nature. The other really important part of that city, I think, that made a big difference was a cinema. A cinema run by a crazy guy It looked like nothing from outside. Inside, it was this huge red velvet hall, 1,000 seats, a giant cinema. It's hard to find these days. And this cinema was playing the most incredible movies. So I started to go all the time to the movies. Jarmusch, Wenders, Werner Herzog, Fassbinder, Bertolucci, Godard, Kubrick, David Lynch. I was interested in the movies. I was 15. I asked a girl from my class if she would come with me to the movies. I took her, she was 14. I took her to the movies. We went there, and it happened to be David Lynch had just released Blue Velvet. So it was a fairly disturbing night for 14, 15-year-old young people. But this stuff could simply happen. You would go there, it wasn't rated R. You could go there and you could watch that movie, and we talked the whole night, we couldn't sleep. It was quite intense. But this idea of narratives and stories that the movies were telling, the idea of protagonists in space, storytelling, was something that I became very interested in. And not only in film, I was interested in the arts, and particularly when I discovered Cindy Sherman's work, her untitled film stills. I thought it was a particular vision to understand architecture as the stage of life, the imaginary actor, the film that never happened, but the moment, an image that could tell an entire story. And what could that mean for us as architects? When I graduated from high school, I graduated in literature, philosophy, maths. And I was interested in all these things, and I thought I would never become an architect. I had a band. I loved music. Then at some point, of course, I had to realize I was so crap at music, I could never really do it. The literature I really liked, fiction writing, but then I thought that can wait. You could still do that anytime. So I thought maybe you should try, at least, to become an architect. At the time, many things were happening in the city. One actually truly visionary moment of someone, Heinrich Klotz, founding the ZKM, the Center for Art and Media Technology, in 1989, one of the first organizations in the world that actually recognized media as art. At MoMA, you couldn't yet. And all the international artists, Namjoon Paik, that were at the forefront of media and video art, were showing in this tiny little place in the middle of nowhere because somebody had that vision. I went to these things. I started to think about the relationship between media and culture, or media and society, to read Marshall McLuhan, to think about that relationship, what was actually happening. My architectural references at the time, and this was already now, of course, the 80s, the heyday of postmodernism. But I couldn't quite relate to what was happening. For me, I was still in the spirit maybe of the 60s or the 70s, the metabolists, Archigram, and maybe one of my most dear and inspiring people that I met in my later part of the life, Cedric Price, with his idea of the fun palace, the idea that there was a participatory form of architecture that could allow people to be part of the stories that would be written and enacted in those spaces. It was a very important year for history in Europe, in Germany. The Berlin Wall fell. And there was clearly a historic moment. It was one of the very few revolutions ever in history without a single moment of bloodshed. And there could have been a moment to also think about architecture anew, to think architecture into the future, to think architecture into a new social experiment. What happened was something else. A German architect called Hans Kohlhoff defined the so-called Kohlhoff plan for Berlin, a fixed eave height, and in a way condemned German architecture to conservatism until today. At this point, I thought I needed a plan for escape. I started to travel, but before traveling, I first had to get rid of everything. I had, of course, long left my parents' house. I was living in my own flat share. I designed my furniture. I had a lot of things around me. Then I thought I want to go somewhere, but I had all that stuff. And then I got rid of absolutely everything. And for almost 20 years, I only had what I could carry with me when I checked into an airplane or got into a car. I realized that any form of possession was holding me back, and I wanted to see things. I wanted to be open, and I made a very dramatic change in my life. During my late high school years, I had also started a little office for model making, because I thought if you want to become an architect, it's good if you learn how, at this time, no computers. Everything was 2D drawings, hand drawings, and you had from a 2D drawing to build a three-dimensional building. Model making is in a way a miniature version of that, a naive miniature version. But so I did that because I wanted to learn how to translate two-dimensional plans into three-dimensional space. Also to make some money so I could buy a little car and start to travel. I drove across Europe, Ticino, Spain, Mies, Paris, France, of course Pompidou, Parc de la Villette, quite new still at the time, brand new, Institut du Monde Arabe. In Paris also Niemeyer, the Communist Party headquarters, an amazing building, La Tourette. And I realized that a lot of the things that were so famous were interesting, but not everything gave me something. I took a decision before my travels. I decided to travel because I did not want to look at a book. I did not want to look at photographs. In fact, I used to take a lot of photos, slides at the time, real camera slides. And then I decided to never take a photograph again. And for 10 years, I didn't take one single picture because I didn't want to see the world through the lens of a camera. I just wanted to go and feel the space. So I had to go to all these places, find them, go inside and see what happened. And quite often, nothing really spectacular happened. These things looked great in the publications, you come there. But then sometimes there were moments I walk into a space and I felt something. And I really felt something and I thought this makes a huge difference. But you only understand that in real space. You only understand that if you're actually there. On these trips, I went to visit or to look for a lot of private houses. A lot of that architecture of the time were private houses. Of course, it's not so easy to go and visit a museum. You buy a ticket, you go in. Private houses, what do you do? So I was climbing over fences, sneaking into gardens, going into... And I did that. The house on the left in Ticino. Climbed over a fence, I'm in the garden, and suddenly I hear a really loud voice yelling from behind me, "What are you doing in my garden?" I'm like, oh no. "Come here." I go there, like, "What are you doing there?" I'm like, "I want to become an architect." So I thought she's going to call the police. And then she said, "You want to become an architect? Come in." And I spent 8 hours with this woman who made tea for me and who told me the story of her life, who told me a story of her having a piece of land on a very steep mountain. She was asking architects to build. Everybody said, "You can't build there." She wanted a Swiss chalet, something very traditional. And then she found one guy who said, "I can build there, but I cannot build there what you want. I can only build what I can do." And then he gave her a little sketch and he said, "Here, it's a concrete box." And she said, "No way, you're crazy." And in the end, he convinced her to build this house. And she said it changed her life. It made her the happiest person. She started to read about architecture. And she said her life completely changed. It was a second life she got through this house. And I thought, how incredible. Then I was in Paris. This was Luigi Snozzi in Ticino, Casa Calman. Then I went to Paris, Villa dell'Ava, Rem Koolhaas. I couldn't sneak into that garden. It was too hermetically sealed, but the house next doors had a construction site going. So I went onto the construction site to take a peek at the neighbor's house. And at this moment, again, a woman busted me, ran out of the house, said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I want to look at this house." She said, "Get off my property. This house has destroyed my entire life. I hate everything and anything about it." And I thought like, wow, architecture can be that powerful. And then I thought, maybe we should try architecture. I continued to travel, then a little bit further. When I could afford a plane ticket, I went to South America, Brazil, Niemeyer, the kind of pleasure of Burle Marx. I went to Mexico, Barragan, color, but also Teotihuacan, the old pyramids. And suddenly I understood something else about architecture, that it was not just about tectonics and detail and space, but there would be almost a meta-order to things sometimes, something that relates to the mountains around, to the stars, to where the sun is setting. And also that was a very powerful feeling. It was one of the moments where suddenly I felt something. And these things stay. They stay with you in a way for the rest of your life. Next year I went to China. 1992 was a time when nobody talked about China. It wasn't on the map, it wasn't in the news. And I went there because actually you couldn't know anything about it unless you went. It was the first year that China was just transitioning into allowing for tourism. Before there was group tourism, you could go to 5 places, then were brought out of the country. I flew into Hong Kong. Of course, I also looked at architecture and Foster. But then I went into Shenzhen, and Shenzhen had just come from this to this. And I discovered a country that completely rewrote everything that I had learned about culture, about history, about personal space. Sometimes I queued for a train ticket for 2.5 days. I stood in line. I came to a city, there were no hotels, so I slept in a workers' dormitory with like 60 people in this kind of space. And it broke everything. I had too nervous, I cried. I thought, I cannot survive this. And of course you can. And after I came back, 3 months in the country, at the end, no idea how I would even make it back. There were no mobile phones. There were not even credit cards. You had a little stack of money strapped to your tummy, and you were going around. I didn't speak the language. I had no idea. I couldn't even read the maps. I didn't know where I was. But I saw that country. And it made a very, very strong impression on me, and in some ways, of course, became the preamble to a long, long story afterwards. I went back and said, okay, let's study, let's learn something. But by the time that I started the first semester, I somehow had managed already to get my first commission, and I built a fashion store, a conversion of an old building. We built an extension in the back, and I built a fashion store. When everybody else at school was just trying to understand what architecture actually meant and was. So at school we were told, you have to solve student living in a garage. Take a garage, where do you put your bed? I said, cool. And I thought this was a very abstract exercise, so I made a very abstract painting out of it. And then I said, but it's very uninteresting to just think about like where I put my bed in the garage. But if we think of this as modular building or modular housing, how can we actually create a community out of that? So I used the same idea of a spine wall with modules attached to it, and I built a huge Siedlung, a complex, a community with courtyards. And in many ways, I realized later that that was almost a preamble to something I did at the end. But I only realized that actually when we were working on the exhibition, that it was an idea of a modular stacking and assembly that would create communal spaces, gardens, courtyards, totally different to just thinking about a building, but thinking how to integrate nature and the space of living and community. I kept on not only questioning the answers, I always questioned the questions, which got me into a lot of trouble, because at school then we got a little plan and section of what you can see standing in the middle there. And then they said, please make a facade for it. But in German, they called it a building skin. And I said, oh, you want us to do a building skin? I'm not going to do a facade. I will build a building skin. And because of this questioning of things, by the end of the year, my models were returned to me by the university, destroyed, and I was the only name missing in the end of year publication because the conflict was so strong that I had no other choice than to leave school. And that's what I did. Time to go. I decided to go to these two people that had such a strong impact with the houses they did. The first one, I went to Lausanne to study with Luigi Snozzi, a grand man in many ways, a political architect, an architect that always thought about the city when he was doing a building, when he was doing a house, a man that always thought about human relationships, even if it was looking like a concrete box. I went there because I wanted to listen. I had never listened before. I had done my thing and ended up leaving. And I came here to listen. And I did 2 projects with him, and each time in the interim presentation, I had the best project. Everything was like, I had an idea. And then I got a critique, and then I thought, no, but this time you're here, don't do your thing again, listen. And I listened. And twice, the first 6 months, the second 6 months, I failed. At the end of each project, I had a very bad project. And I realized that that also doesn't work. You have to learn, but not to listen. You have to go somewhere to understand, but you cannot lose sight of what you're actually trying to do. After Lausanne, I went to work with Rem. I had not only become aware of him because of the house, but he had actually done a design for the Center for Art and Media Technology in my hometown that was never built. And I was interested in it because he was somebody who thought about architecture in terms of society as well, in a very different way, in terms of media, in terms of society. I came to the office 1 week before SMLXL came out. I was there when Rem opened the first box. We were 35 people. We had, I think, 32 chairs and 28 pens in the office. So it was wild days. But one interesting moment was when I showed him my portfolio. I had just done a competition for on the right side, that thing. A competition for a building in Germany. Then he jumped up and he started like, when did you do this? Like, what? And he said, come. And he pulled me into the office and he showed me what is on the left side, which is the villa in Bordeaux that he had been working on. And if you see, the section is almost exactly the same. It's a floating box, an open space, a sunken part, and a void connecting it in the middle. And there was this moment of kind of, this was the beginning. We had both done something that was weirdly similar. And maybe that was the beginning of a very strong collaboration we had, because there was very often some similar thinking. I went back to New York. New York was an adventure. 97, there was still meat in the meatpacking district. There was blood. There was a place called Florent, a diner. I had dinner every night at 3 or 4 a.m. because the rest we were working. I went back to the World Trade Center, sitting upstairs, talking to my friend, looking out. And I was interested in understanding a city, so I started to take the New York map, and it was so easy with the grid, and I walked the grid, every avenue, up and down, up and down. For 2 weeks, I just walked 16 hours a day to walk the entire grid. And I became obsessed with this idea of the flaneur and the city and the adventure. I started to read about flaneur. I worked with graphic designers, actually not with architects. We worked for PS1, which later became part of MoMA for the Whitney Museum. And then I went to London. I thought, I had stopped my studies, right? I had abandoned everything, and I thought maybe I will never do it. Then I thought, let's go to the AA. And I didn't want to do design, I wanted to do something else. By then, a shaved head. And I started in a studio, Diploma 10, that came from the lineage of the situationists, the Derive, the ideas. And I did 2 projects that were, in a way, what I called organizational structures. They were ways to, the first project, VX project, was a way to reorganize and reutilize empty space in London, use technology and a smart card system to connect it to existing services. And it's actually something that today you could quite quickly describe as a co-living concept. But of course that didn't exist. The second project I did was speculating how a city government could function differently. I wanted to separate a mayor's function into physical and virtual reality. I defined a series of new terms that would allow us to measure value of real space and value of virtual space. I started to remap London according to that. Then I had the idea to basically hijack all the digital devices that existed in the city, cash machines and other things, and create a communal digital communication system. In a way, a sort of city Facebook for a city to be able to communicate with the citizens in a different way and to have a feedback loop in understanding what actually happened. Then I met, actually in New York, I had met Klaus Biesenbach through him, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and then Hu Han-Ru, and I started to work on an exhibition called Cities on the Move. Hans-Ulrich and Han-Ru had curated that. It came to London to the Hayward Gallery, and then I was working with them and created an almost situationist plan for an exhibition in which we built nothing. I simply, even the model, we reused the model that the previous exhibition had done. I reused things from Zaha's fashion show from before. We turned them upside down, turned them into buildings. We cut holes into walls. We used benches and put them up as display boards. And it was 100% an idea of recycling everything that was there. Probably the most sustainable exhibition to that time ever done. But the idea was a different one. It was that of improvising the Asian city because it was an exhibition about the Asian city. At the time, I met Cedric Price and had the great luck to spend many early mornings with him in his studio. And he made a sketch for a time-space continuum, which this became when the thing went to Bangkok. And I will just now click through a little bit further. I went back later, and when I was in Bangkok, Ram called me and said, "You're absolutely insane to be out there, do this exhibition, come back. I want you to run the projects for Prada." I came back, we built the store in New York and in Beverly Hills. And it was a strange thing suddenly to be catapulted in a different kind of mediatized society in which all of a sudden it was all about glamour, stardom, and where all of a sudden even myself, I became a model again in the Communist Party headquarters for Italian Vogue in a kind of weird feedback loop of history. Then I went to Beijing, and I went to Beijing at a moment when China had won the Olympics, Beijing, a World Trade Organization, and we had just won this competition to build the second largest building in the world. And I went to Beijing to build this thing. It took me almost 10 years of my life. It was 7 years with not one day off. And we created, again, a piece of architecture that would sit in a very strange way in a world of media, in a very official way, that would, again, suddenly this was no more Prada. This was a different iconography of mediatized reality. It showed up in The Simpsons, in Transformers, and all of a sudden, again, architecture had become something that went way beyond what we as architects had created as physical space. On one of the concrete columns, we found a poem by the migrant workers that were talking about their pride of them building the future of their country. I was turned into the Lord of Towers by various media, and on the back of that, had to remember this one billboard I found on the site when I arrived in Beijing that said, adjust during development, develop during adjustment. The idea that when you go somewhere, you cannot just come as who you are, you also have to become somebody else as you are there. I went to teach in Hong Kong, a studio on towers and cores and not the facades, and then finally started my own office almost 15 years ago. With humble beginnings, we very quickly got a series of very big commissions. Many of them built the Guardian Art Center. We continued Mahana-Kon, the Duo Towers. And the office became a little bit still what it is today. Of course, a crazy place of work. This is a Chinese artist who came to take a portrait of our office in the early days, which was part of a guest-curated wallpaper issue I did at the time. The floating cinema, and again, a collaboration with local villagers to reuse materials and work with that. And I think this is the end. Thank you very much.
This is it. All right.